Okay, hello class. We're going to go over chapter 4 right now and do a quick summary of the chapter. Okay, so first off, chapter 4 is all about estimating potential harm. And what we're trying to get to is the point where you can take the information from chapters 1, 2, and 3 and start recognizing, okay, what type of danger is there and how can we start preparing a response. Okay, so first off, we start off with some interesting terminology, TLV, PEL, threshold limits. These are basically industry's way of creating standards to say, hey, listen, we have to measure and then find out what hazard we're dealing with. And if you work in an environment that contains hazards, you need to have the correct protection. You're only allowed a certain amount of exposure for a certain amount of time. Okay, there's not going to be a lot of questions about these different things. There may be one or two. So if you could just have a very general understanding to be able to differentiate between the two, that's important. One thing that is really important is IDLH. You need to be familiar with that term. You need to be able to pick it out. That's something that we use all the time in the fire service as well as hazardous materials, is the term IDLH. And it's important for us to recognize, hey, are we working in IDLH? And then what does that mean for us? And that usually means we need to be obviously in protective gear. We need to have an SCBA on. We need to have means of access and egress. We need to have backup team. All these different things if we're working within an IDLH. It does mention a little SCBA stuff in here, which is good. One thing that's really interesting is if you look in your book and you see this green page right here, this is about how we take into account wind direction and evacuation zones. So that's pretty interesting. That's something that we do in real life. We look at our hot zone. We say, okay, we base this off the MSDS, initially the ERG, then the MSDS, and then we take into account wind direction, and we scale that downwind and expand it out so that we say, okay, well, based off wind direction and based off what we're dealing with, we know this section housing or this building falls within that zone, so we're going to evacuate that or shelter it in place. So that's pretty interesting. That can all be found in your ERG. Okay, you can tell that by the green pages. And of course, this does, mention the ERG, as a lot of chapters will. It's a very important, resource guide for us. So it's important that you understand what the different sections in the ERG do. We talk about evacuation a little bit. We do talk about sheltering in place. That's a very, very important topic. So make sure you read that. Pay attention to that. Let's see here. We talk about wind direction. It mentions, litmus paper again. It also talks about the different types of releases. Going back to chapter 2, solid, liquid, gas, and how the state of the hazardous material affects how we plan our response. And of course, the easiest one to manage is the least frequent, and that would be a solid. After that, liquid, because it stays somewhat contained and usually does release some vapors, but gases are usually, or vapor release is usually the most challenging for us because it's difficult to find, it travels easily and quickly, it's not visually identifiable oftentimes, so those things take into account our initial response and how we plan for that, okay? Secondary attacks, something that's mentioned, and that's important for us. We're going to hit that a little bit later on in the semester, but that's really a focused attack based on us as the target, first responders as the target. We've seen this across the world. Doesn't happen very often here, but we recently had firefighters that were killed in Michigan that were responding to a house fire and then were ambushed and shot and killed. So it does happen here. That would be considered a secondary attack. They start something to draw the first responders in, and then the next attack is based on looking to harm us. PPE and starting to get into the PPE is really an important part of this chapter. Okay, we talk about penetration, permeation, and degradation. Those are important, those three topics. You're going to need to know all of them. Penetration, permeation, and degradation. Okay, so know what those are. Talks about the different levels. Okay, level A, B, and C. Remember, level A, fully encapsulated. Okay, no vapors can get in. All right, that's for vapor protection. SCBA is underneath, which is good. B and C, your respiratory protection is on the outside. That's mainly for splash protection. Okay, the big difference between B and C is C uses a respirator, not an SCBA. okay, which is great for industry. If you're working with something, you know you're working with chemical X, then you can wear a respirator with chemical X, much more lightweight. You can work on it all day long. It's easy to go. An SCBA, weighs 30, 40 pounds. It's a limited air supply. You can only work for 40, 45 minutes. But it protects you against everything. That's why we use an SCBA, because it's our own air. So that's the big difference. Know the difference between level B and C. You will be questioned on that. And then, of course, level D is basically just work clothing. Know the pictures of, respirators, supplied air. You'll see a picture of supplied air. This guy right up here. Okay? That's what we look like when we do confined space. So we use supplied air also in hazardous materials, and we'll get to that at the very end of the chapter, but at the very end of the class. But that's what we wear. We wear a harness. Air tank is back at an air cart, and we just carry in long 300-foot tubes that supply our air for us, and that allows us to work longer and have somebody else manage our air so that we can be a little thinner and we can get through piping and stuff like that if we need to get down in a confined space and find somebody. So it talks about, supplied circuit, closed circuit, respirators. Review all those topics. Those are important. You should be able to distinguish between them. All right. Does give you just a little touch on primary, secondary contamination. We're going to hit that really, really hard in Decon in chapters 8 and 9. So don't spend too much time on that. Focus on the areas that I mentioned and take the quiz.